welcome to another episode of A Language I Love Is, the podcast that's all about languages, linguistics, and love. I'm your host, Danny, and today's episode sees us returning to the rich linguistic landscape of Mexico. Today's beloved language is Purépecha, introduced by expert linguist Dr. Kate Bellamy. As Kate will tell us, this is an influential and long-documented language, yet one seemingly all alone in its family tree, without any known relatives.
Hiarina Rangadela, Sirondaranapuesca, Maequasca temben Timangüe Rinjatiriska, Timangua Pechanca Ranga, Marina Ran Pedro, Catemben Timangüe Rinjatiristi, Camaterarina Rantigüe, Cayum Tam Hueshurin Hatiristi, Juchita Chatarina Ran Joaquín, y Manorte Sis Hamashandi, Paguan, Tip Jimbo Joren Pechinga, Ishu Jorenguaro. Terushut Kimbo Paguan Tirek Umantashinga, Katatsek Shurikun Kamaman Haruatani.
So, my guest today is joining me all the way from the University of Chicago, and my guest today is Dr. Kate Bellamy. She is a researcher at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and I'm absolutely thrilled that today we are embarking on a journey back into the languages of Mexico to talk about a whole new language, a language that I don't even believe has been referenced on this podcast so far. So it's new territory all around, and I'm really excited about getting stuck into this language, which frankly, I know nothing about. So, like you, dear listener, this is all new information for me too. First things first, Kate, how are you? How are you feeling today? And how's Chicago?
I'm feeling great, thanks. Chicago is, as the name would suggest, a little bit windy today. It's nice and sunny for a change. It was snowing when I got here, which was absolutely horrifying. But that seems to have gone. But yeah, I'm settling in well. I got here on Thursday, off to the archive this afternoon.
Sounds like a lovely day that you've got ahead of you, and hopefully we can get into the reason as to why you are currently in the United States of America and not in the Netherlands, but I'm jumping ahead of myself. At this juncture, I have a very simple question to pose to you, which is, could you please introduce the language that you love and want to talk about today?
Yes, with great pleasure. And I always love talking about this language, which is called Purépecha.
Fantastic. Okay, Purépecha. First things first, where in the world can we find speakers of Purépecha?
So if you like, the homeland for Purépecha speakers is in the state of Michoacán in the west of Mexico. So that's kind of roughly directly west of Mexico City, kind of center west. It's a large, quite mountainous state that kind of goes down into like flatlands, what they call the hotlands, and has a very long coast on the Pacific. And so in the northwest of the state of Michoacán, in four kind of roughly contiguous regions, this is where the Purépecha speakers live. There's also, and that's part of the reason that I'm here in Chicago, there's also quite a large diaspora community of Purépecha speakers and people who culturally identify as Purépecha. In fact, not just in Chicago, but that's partly why I'm here, but also in many other places across the US, particularly in Oregon, for example, Washington State. There are large communities of Purépecha in California, also North Carolina, in lots of places, but really the largest centers seem to be Chicago, Oregon, and California.
I know this is a difficult question, it's always hard to put a number on these things, but roughly how many speakers of this language are we talking? I know it's complicated because there's a lot of bilingualism or multilingualism in Mexico, but whatever number you choose and how you choose to define it, how many speakers are we talking here?
Well, the last Mexican census that was released, so that was numbers from 2020, indicates there are about 140,000 speakers of Purépecha in Mexico. And that is based on self-evaluation of being a speaker. So it's highly likely that at least around 90% of those speakers are bilingual with Spanish, which is the national language of Mexico and basically the language for all secondary and university education, administration, media and all that. So probably around 140,000 in Michoacan, and mostly in Michoacan. There's a few outside of there. And then numbers in the US are very hard to come by. There are, according to the director of the Casa Michoacan, more than 200,000 people from Michoacan living in, I believe, in Illinois. So it is a proportion of that number. It's hard to know. But there are a lot of migrants from Michoacan in this area.
And just off what you're saying here, can I presume that there is a Purepecha people, a fairly unified people who define themselves through their use of this language? Is that fair to say?
I think you could definitely define a people called the Purepecha, that you also find referred to historically as the Tarascans, kind of direct descendants. It's the same people. It is not just the language that defines you. You can be culturally Purepecha and not speak the language, which is the case in some villages in Michoacan, and is the case for some individuals who live here in the US. But the Purepecha language is a large part of what it means to be Purepecha.
As listeners will know, I am very much a historian at heart, and I'm always tempted at this juncture to ask about the historical sources. When do we start to see sources for this language? How far back in time can we go within the historical linguistics of Purepecha?
What you probably don't know, and what the listeners probably don't know either, is that Purepecha was one of the first indigenous languages of the Americas to be described. So I think the first indigenous language to be described linguistically and then have a grammar printed of it was Nahuatl, I believe in the 1530s or 1540s. But the first dictionary of Purepecha was published in 1558. Sorry, no, the first grammar in 1558, the first dictionary in 1559 by a Franciscan priest. He's called in Spanish Maturino Gilberti, but probably was called Mathurin Gilbert. He was French, perhaps from Poitiers or Toulouse. It's not entirely clear. But I think he arrived in Mexico in about 1540, dedicated his life to evangelizing the Purepecha people. But what he did leave behind is actually some very early description, also translations of Catholic sermons and doctrines from the mid-16th century. And if you consider that the Spanish invaded in 1521, a dictionary and a grammar in the late 1550s is already pretty early. So in that respect, we really have kind of quite old documentation in Mesoamerican terms, because there aren't that many languages that were of Mesoamerica or Mexico that were written down before the conquest. So this is kind of almost as early as it gets in terms of colonial documentation.
And is it possible, off the basis of these records, to talk about old Purepecha, or at least different stages within the language? Has it changed much from that earlier point in time?
This is the point where we actually don't know that much, that we have these transcribed documents, but there's not a great deal of historical linguistic work done on Purepecha. This is one of my many, many future projects. And also part of the reason for that is also, and I think we'll come to this in a bit, is the fact that it's a language isolate. So historical linguistics of language isolates is kind of necessarily done in a slightly different way. But so the last time I was in Chicago was last May, June. I was working at a library called the Newbury Library, which is a public research library in downtown Chicago, where there is a dictionary, a Spanish Purepecha dictionary dating to 1647. So this is, it's about 100 years, just over 100 years after the arrival of the Spanish. But what it does show, as I have been working on a bit of lexical analysis, we can see that there are word initial vowels in some words that are no longer present in the vast majority of Purepecha varieties. So if you take the word for corn, a very important word in Purepecha and across all Mesoamerican societies, the word for corn in modern day Purepecha is tsiri, so with the stress on the first syllable. But in this dictionary, dating to 1647, it begins with an a, it's atsiri. So the stress is on the second syllable, which is in fact where you would expect it. Stress tends to fall on the second syllable. So we can see also in the word for honey, which in modern day Purepecha is tequa, it's in the 1647 dictionaries is atequa. So we have this word initial vowel, which in the case of tequa, the word for honey, has been completely lost. That said, in the case of corn, maize, tsiri, there are still one or two communities. I was told this on Saturday by some speakers from the kind of the mountainous area called the Sierra, where they still say atsiri with the a at the beginning. So we can see that this, what would it have been 400 years ago, these word initial vowels were absolutely present, but we can see that in the majority of cases, the majority of varieties, that the vowel has been lost, and so we see the stress is retained on the same syllable. So now we're seeing word initial stress, which kind of, if you don't know the history of the words, it kind of, raises a kind of a red flag, like what's it doing there? So in that sense, I mean, there's a lot we can learn from the historical material, even the translations. There are a lot of translations from Spanish, but I think even so, especially in terms of lexical change and sound changes, I think there's a huge amount of work still to be done, to be honest with you.
It makes me want to just get stuck into it right now. I don't have any training or any knowledge, but it sounds wonderful. You mentioned the word varieties there. Off that basis, can I presume that there's diversity within Purepecha and sort of perceived dialects, perhaps variation according to geography?
Yeah, there's definitely dialect variation, particularly in phonology. It doesn't correlate very well with geography, which is interesting. So in the word Purepecha, as of the people and of the language, the r in some varieties, so in some dialects, has shifted to l. So in some places they say Pulepecha. And interestingly, that's a very common change around the lake known as Lake Pátzcuaro, which is more in the east on the lower side of the Purepecha-speaking territory. But that change has also occurred way over in the west, up in a very high, sort of more mountainous area. And these places are absolutely not in very much contact. And you'd have to get over all kinds of hills to get between them. So it's still kind of unclear what's driving this variation, whether it's that people from this area migrated there, or whether it's just a kind of a change in progress that's happening in different places at different speeds. It's unclear. But what's interesting is if you ask, and I've asked speakers about this, you can identify where someone's from, sometimes on the basis of kind of very simple things like the greetings that they use, or perhaps the word that they use for bread or for tortilla. And people often have a very good awareness of these differences. There's not so big as to impede comprehension, with the exception of one village, which is the village of Angawan, where they speak this variety which has undergone some really extreme sound changes. I like to kind of compare it to Glasgow. You can understand it as a Purepecha speaker, you just need a while to get used to it. So like me as a speaker of British English, of Sheffield English originally, I will understand the Glaswegian English. I think that's a reasonable sort of parallel. It clearly is the same language. It's just, for whatever reason, has undergone these changes that are more extreme than in other places.
One more question that comes to mind is, I did not know that at all about the very early date of attestation, or relatively early attestation for this language, which is fantastic. Those people at the very beginning who are describing, documenting the language, they would have been writing in Spanish and in French using the Latin alphabet. Is this something that Purepecha continues to do? And also, is there an official script for this language? Are there kind of institutions that are standardizing, promoting the language as people may be well familiar with from, say, European languages, Spanish, for example?
They do continue to use the Latin alphabet, and there have been multiple proposals. I think perhaps 12 or 14 different proposals for the alphabet that should be used, but there is currently no consensus on which should be used, and it can lead to quite lively debate how you go about representing the language orthographically. A bit like in the earlier days of Spanish orthography, you have kind of two main camps, I suppose you could put it that way. You have like the phoneticists who are in favor of spelling the language how it sounds. As an example, if you take the word for what, it's ambe. So A-M-B-E, the phoneticists would write it. But B is not a phoneme in Purepecha. It appears as an allophone of P rather after nasals. So you have ambe, but only in this allophonic context. So the phoneticists would say, okay, we should write this A-M-B-E. Then in the other camp, you have the sort of etymologists like, no, but it's a P, there is no B. And then you have those who want kind of maximum clarity in terms of one sound, one letter, which is what I'm personally in favor of, but I don't get involved in this debate. So, for example, the big sticking point here is how you represent U and W, U and W. And in a lot of the alphabets that have been proposed, and a lot of the people who write, it's not everybody writes, they will use the letter U to represent both U and W, which is not incredibly efficient. And I think in terms of learning, because they can both appear in the same position, they can both appear word initially, for example. I personally think it would be helpful to differentiate them orthographically. The same with E and Y, which are both written generally with the letter I. They generally don't use the Y. So these are debates that are ongoing, and so there's no one agreed upon standard. And you see this also in so educational material, books that are printed for teaching Purepecha in primary schools, for example. They're not all printed using the same orthographic conventions. I mean, I think it's not necessarily a problem. I mean, you look at like US versus UK English, there are certain differences. I still know what colour means if it doesn't have a U in it. All this to say there isn't an agreed upon standard.
It's an age-old tale, these kind of two poles, or this spectrum of, do you go towards more etymology? Do you go towards trying to be as phonetic as possible? I don't think any language has got it right. I think some languages may be wronger than others, maybe the one that we're speaking right now. But but nonetheless, I completely understand why these debates are happening. Now I get to ask the question that I've been most looking forward to, because as regular listeners to this podcast will know, I always like to dive into the history and the genealogy specifically of every language. So where does it come from? What languages is it connected to? Their development, etc. But as you've already mentioned, today on A Language I Love we have our first language isolate. And I'm very happy about that. It's fantastic. It doesn't mess with the format at all, because I'm very keen to know, firstly, could you explain to the listeners, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a language isolate? And most importantly, why do we think that? Why do we think that Purepecha has this status?
So a language isolate is a language that has no known sister languages, so it cannot be connected through regular sound correspondences in the lexicon to any other known living or extinct language. It's not to say that it never was, that it has always been an isolate. I think that's important to underline. But now, and as far as we can tell from, well, this is my opinion. I should probably preface everything that I say with that there is no convincing evidence to my mind that Purepecha can be connected to any other living or extinct language in the Americas or anywhere, because there have been some fairly wild proposals, actually, about what languages it could be related to. I think I'm going to start with the wildest, just because you're probably not expecting this at all. There is a book-length treatment from 1985 that explains why Purepecha is related to Sanskrit.
It's always Sanskrit.
It's really quite remarkable. There have been many attempts to connect Purepecha to other languages. There seems to be something about language isolates that bothers people, that they just can't accept that a language doesn't fit into a family somewhere, that it doesn't have any relatives. And I think the same is true of Basque. It's kind of this, decades, centuries long attempts to connect it to some other language. And in fact, Purepecha has been connected to Basque, because then somehow some linguists think that, well, if this is an isolate and that's an isolate, then perhaps they're connected somehow. So Purepecha has also been subject to some, fairly shaky lexical comparison to Basque, to languages of the Caucasus. But the proposals that really stuck, and actually to this day still get mentioned, are those that were put forward by Maurice Swadesh. So the very famous linguist of Swadesh list fame, of course. He proposed in the 1950s that Purepecha is connected to Quechua in the Andes, and then also a bit more distantly to Aymara, but then also to Zuni in the Southwest United States. But if you actually really dig into this proposal, the lexical sets that he provides are just terrible. As a historical linguist, I think you just throw them out the window. There's no consistency. There's no systematicity in the correspondences. It's really just kind of sets of lookalikes. And then even then, the lookalikes can not look that much alike, in fact. And it's a very small number of words as well. So I really don't consider that sufficient to claim any kind of genealogical relationship between Purépecha and Quechua. Other scholars have cited the structure of the languages as a reason why they might be connected. So Purépecha and Quechua are both heavily agglutinating. They both work on this root plus suffix structure. They have a large number of slots that have very templatic verbs, and they have a large number of slots following the root. And some of these suffixes look quite similar, but we're talking about CV syllables. So I think they both share the suffix pu, for example, and the suffix pa. But if you have a kind of CV, a general CV or CCV structure, which is what I think Purépecha and Quechua both do, then it's not that surprising that at some point these fairly commonly occurring sounds are going to occur in the same order in the two languages. And then also the ordering of the suffixes. I don't think it comes as a surprise either that they occur in roughly the same order. That, derivation tends to occur closest to the root, inflection occurs further away, and there are various accounts, like Joan Bybee, for example, that give sort of a more cognitive explanation for why this would be the case. So that for me as well is not sufficiently convincing for it to be pursued any further as a genealogical relationship.
And are there any attempts to connect it to some sort of really big, overarching macro family? Like, I understand that its position would be very unclear, but is it truly alone in your eyes as a language? Is there really no connections to be made?
I really think it is truly alone. I mean, when Swadesh connected it to Zuni and Quechua, he actually included all of them in what he called macro-Penutian. But the evidence for macro-Penutian is fairly flimsy, and it's not really, I don't think it's been entertained as a serious macro family since then. I don't think it is now. I think it's possible that there were languages related to Purépecha, perhaps relatively closely, spoken in what is now Mexico before the Spanish arrived, or around the time that they did arrive. Because there are indications in some of the early colonial documentation where the Spanish administrators were going around basically running censuses with the local people to find out who they were, what language they spoke, how much they could extract from them, I suppose. And there are language names in these censuses from the late 16th century which don't seem to have modern day counterparts. And I mean, if you think about it, the number of indigenous people who died after the arrival of the Spanish was absolutely enormous. So unfortunately, it may be the case that if these were smaller groups of people, if a large proportion of them didn't survive, it may be that perhaps the language died out that way, or those who remained then became integrated into other groups because there would have been large amounts of multilingualism as well. I wouldn't be surprised if there was at least one language related to Purépecha at the beginning of the colonial era, but that didn't survive. I don't have evidence, but I think it's not beyond the bounds of possibility.
Now, as regular listeners of the podcast will know, this is our chance to turn away from the language that we love and are so enthusiastic about today, and to dive into the one person who is introducing us to it, which is, of course, yourself, Kate. I'm curious, how did you come to know and also love Purépecha? What's the story? Because you mentioned your origins in Sheffield, which is fairly far away from West Mexico, as the crow flies. So could you tell us, how'd you get from point A to point B?
Well, it's a terribly long story. So I'll cut out, maybe about 28 years of it and jump to the point where I decided that I really wanted to go back to study. So my first degree had been in what is called modern and medieval languages, which to all intents and purposes was French and Italian, but with an emphasis on linguistics. So I did a bit of historical linguistics. I did some syntax of languages of Italy, comparative Romance, also from more of a kind of historical perspective. And I always loved it. I really loved it, but didn't have the opportunity to continue studying immediately after the BA. So I did what all, self-respecting 23-year-old does. And I went to work for a brewery, which really, it had its perks, I'll be honest. I was highly unsuited for the job that I was doing. And so I ended up leaving in the end and working for a company that had contracts related to higher and vocational education. After a couple of years, I moved into the research section of that organization and really started to realize that I had to get out of the UK, that all of this exposure to Europe that I'd loved so much. I'd lived in France as a student. I'd also worked in France. I thought, no, I have to get back. I have to get back to proper Europe. And so via a job in Luxembourg, I decided to go back to studying and to pursue the linguistics again. Because it'd always been kind of in the back of my mind that I wanted to go back to university. I felt that I hadn't finished that whole process, that journey, if you want to call it that. And I was living in Luxembourg, and so I was looking around at where I could study. And I absolutely did not want to go back to the UK to study. But I had the restriction of having to study either in English or in French. And I looked at programs in the Netherlands. And when I saw the one in Leiden, I was just sold. I enrolled in the Research Master Structure and Variation in Languages of the World. And so really looking at language diversity, looking at this incredible range of languages that people in Leiden work on, it was like a dream, being exposed to all of these languages, many of which, in fact, I'd never heard of. One of the courses that I took was an introduction to languages of the Americas with the professor who was to become my PhD supervisor, Willem Adelaar, who is a specialist of the Quechuan languages. He wrote a grammar of, I think, Tama Quechua for his PhD thesis. And he tells wonderful stories about how he was doing fieldwork in the 60s of wading through rivers with his notebooks, above his head and his cassette recorder. That really opened my eyes to typological diversity in languages. I also, at that point, got interested in Georgian and in Caucasian languages. And in fact, I ended up going to Tbilisi to be the inaugural Leiden-Tbilisi exchange student in 2012. I spent a semester there learning Georgian and Russian simultaneously. Would not recommend. It was an absolute workout for the brain. I couldn't read Russian before I went. I certainly couldn't read Georgian. So this was an absolute baptism of fire. And I wrote my MA thesis at the same time. And it was a wonderful time. It was a fantastic time to be in Tbilisi as well. And that really also kind of ignited this fire, this thought that I really want to continue doing research. There is so much we don't understand. There's so many languages that we don't know enough about. And so once I'd finished the MA and I came back to the Netherlands, I started applying for PhD programs. And one of them that I eventually applied for, maybe about 9 months later, was with Willem Adelaar, my erstwhile professor of languages of the Americas, on Purepecha. And up until that point, I should probably admit that I hadn't really heard of Purepecha. We hadn't focused on it in the languages of the Americas because you're talking about thousands of languages. It's necessarily not going to be able to go into depth in all of them. And so it was a project, part of a wider ERC project called the Linguistic Past of Mesoamerica and the Andes, which was looking to pursue these ideas that there might have been pre-Hispanic contact between West Mexico, so where Purepecha is spoken, and the Andean region, which kind of picks up again on this connection between Purepecha and Quechua that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And so it was a more of a historical project, which wasn't necessarily something that I was thinking of getting into, but I really enjoyed the fact that it helped me to read very widely. So in archaeology and anthropology, I had a month of being obsessed with network theory. It was fantastic because in order to try and understand where the people were, when you have a relatively limited documentation, it's very important to understand the history and the prehistory. it was from there really that my fascination took hold. And since then, I've been working on successive research projects related to purepecha, but also taking into account language contact and multilingualism. Virtually no language, occurs in a bubble, in a figurative bubble. There's always influences and change. So I'm also kind of part of what I do is also looking at both historic and synchronic effects of language contact and code switching in particular. So yeah, I trying to pursue these themes through different funders, basically.
And a question that comes immediately to my mind is that clearly one of the languages that's going to have a little bit of contact effect is Spanish, but you're currently in Chicago, where you have a bilingual population there. Is English having an effect on the language?
This is something that I want to look into. My guess would be yes. I think there are clear predictions that we could make as well. I think, especially when it comes to something like a feature like pro-drop, for example. In purepecha, you have a lot of flexibility that you can indicate the subject of a clause either with an independent subject pronoun or with a subject clitic, or both, or neither, because you also mark person through mood suffixes. In Spanish, it's also pro-drop. So there's still a considerable amount of variation in Michoacan, but you see there are some places where they prefer just to use the clitic. You don't need to use the overt subject pronoun. But my prediction would be here, there would be a greater propensity to use an overt subject pronoun because of the influence of English, because English is simply not pro-drop. And this is actually one of the questions that I'm looking to go in part way to answer in my current research project. So it's also why I'm going to be interviewing people here, to find out how they speak purepecha. I'm fascinated to find out. I met a woman on Saturday who spoke to me in English, clearly purepecha, about 25 years old, was born in the US, speaks purepecha, but then also speaks English. So you can see, these dynamics are changing. And then you also have people who are trilingual, purepecha, Spanish, English. So how are the different pressures exerting themselves? I think there's so many questions. I think it's a very fascinating place to be. I'll report back when I have a bit more data.
So, time for the second question that is integral to the whole format of this podcast. You've given us a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of love for this language so far, but amidst all that expertise and enthusiasm, can I get you to narrow down one thing you love about this language? Could be anything, you have free rein, but please tell us, what is it?
It's really difficult to narrow this down to one thing. But I think the one thing that I really love about purepecha is that it has 12 different roots that refer to how things stink, and that these form verbs in a particular way. They have their own smell template, if you like. So you can have a root like kini, for example, which means to stink, like from body dirt, especially of an unwashed person. Or you have the root huitzi, which is actually probably my favorite because it is translated by the late Paul Friedrich as to stink badly, such as in a bar when men have vomited and urinated the night before. It evokes a very particular smell and actually a very particular image in this instance. But the amazing thing about these roots is that they don't just refer to that particular smell. That is just an example of the type of smell they refer to. And the way that you form this kind of stink verb, this kind of template, is that you reduplicate the root, so kini or kuitsi, and then you add two suffixes that are called spatial location suffixes, or locative space suffixes in purepecha. And so these refer to different regions or areas of the body where an event or an action might take place. And so in this case, they combine the suffix ku, which refers to the hand, with the suffix ndi, which kind of refers to this area, so down the side of the ear into the neck, and then where the neck meets the shoulder and onto the shoulder. So this sort of 90-degree angle area here. And so you would have something like kini kini kundin, and ni is the non-finite marker at the end. And that's how you say, that's the infinitive for this particular kind of stinking. it's not unique to Purepecha. There are other languages in the world that have these kind of specific terms for smells. And or what they share, in fact, is that these terms are abstract. It doesn't mean the smell of that bar where men have been doing whatever they've been doing. That's just an example of that kind of smell. You know, like in the same way that red is abstract, and many things can be red. Many things can be this smell. It's just that's a kind of prototypical example in the way that you have things which are prototypically red. You know, think, yeah, that's like a proper red. So that I think is something that's very, very particular to Purepecha, especially with this template. And I think also one of the things that I really love the most about it. Or love the most about it, that's not fair. It's one of the things I love about it, is that you have the ability to say these things.
Okay, yeah, not one word of that did I expect. Super, absolutely super. Extremely specific kinds of stinking reflected in morphology. So after that wonderful little morsel of the lexicon of Purepecha, I'm afraid I have to move you on to the third and final question, which is, what is your parting point when it comes to this language? Aside from the very specific stinkiness that goes on in this speech community, what is something that you think we should now know about this language?
I think what's really important to know about Purepecha is how flexible it is as a language, the way that you can build words. And as a learner, that can also be a lot of fun because it means you can also build new words that can be understandable to speakers. Perhaps to give you an example of the flexibility, say you take a root, like the root pire, means sing. If you add the suffix qua to pire, qua is a nominalizer, you have sing thing, you have song. You have pire, you add the suffix ri, it's an agentive nominalizer, you have singer. You want to say, I'm singing, pire shaka. So you take this root, or you say, I'm singing whilst going away, pire mushaka, something like this. You know, you can build it up from this root, and you can build up so many kind of almost infinite meanings just from this one root. And I think that flexibility and the kind of the real satisfaction that it can give you to build it up and create well-formed words is something that's, I think is important to take away. And if I may permit myself one further takeaway for the listeners, which is more about the people than the language, I think that people should just know that Purepecha exists, because I'm sure most of our listeners have heard of the Aztecs, that they've heard of the Maya, but they've probably never heard of the Purepecha or the Tarascans, which is how they were referred to historically. And the Tarascans were actually one of the great empires of Mesoamerica. They were a rival empire to the Aztecs. In fact, the only people to ever successfully repel the Aztecs. And pretty much nobody knows this. And I feel like it's almost become like one of my life's tasks is to share this with people and to let them know that Mexico, modern day Mexico and historic Mexico is more than that. Of course, the Aztecs and the Maya are very important, but that for the history of what is modern Mexico, and for the region before it was Mexico, the Purepecha were incredibly important. And I think the early description of their language is also testament to how important they were as a people. They were the head of a large, multicultural, multilingual, stratified, society and empire that was also in a very strategic location between what is now Mexico City and the coast, the Pacific coast. I think it's important that people know this, and that we can try and recognize the Purepecha's importance and their place in the history of Mexico and in modern day Mexico.
Well, it's a pleasure and a privilege to contribute to that effort to spread the word. Speaking for myself and speaking on behalf of the listeners, it's working. I feel, enriched in my knowledge of this corner of the world. I say corner, it's a massive place. So yeah, super important, and it's so good to have this extra and new information. Well, I think, again, if I can speak for myself and again on behalf of the listeners, just thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to that. I think people at home listening will enjoy it too. That was super. Thank you so much, Kate.
No, thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
This show's final fun facts are my space to share cool connections that I think you'll like, usually between the starring language and English. For this episode, though, thinking of links between English and this language isolate of Mexico is, well, tricky. Instead, I'd like to talk a little bit more about language isolates, specifically how sometimes languages can lose that status when long-lost relatives are proposed through new scholarship. In the case of Purépecha, as Kate has worked so hard to show, its classification as an isolate is very unlikely to change. But it did happen with Etruscan. Yes, I know, it's very like me to bring the topic back to ancient Europe, but bear with me. Etruscan, the ancient language of Italy, was at one point commonly considered to be another language isolate, adrift within a sea of Indo-European. It's still classed as such in its entry in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, for example. Nowadays, though, the tide has turned, following the work of Helmut Rix in the 1990s. A Tyrrhenian family has been proposed and widely accepted, which includes Etruscan and two other scarcely documented ancient languages, Rhetic, found in the Alps, and Lemnium, documented on the island of Lemnos in the Aegean Sea. On the basis of their similarities in their vocabulary and grammar, these three do look to be related, but how do we account for their geography? Did Lemnian speakers come from Italy, or did the Etruscans migrate from the Aegean region? The latter would agree with the view of the ancient historian Herodotus, that the Etruscans were migrants from Anatolia. Questions abound, but, as Kate has achieved with Purépecha, a careful consideration of all the facts is the way to make progress. So, that's everything for this episode. If you like what you're hearing, please do subscribe and give the show a rating wherever you get your podcasts, and recommend it to all your friends and family to help share the linguistic love. My thanks go to my guest today, Kate, and also to you, dear listener, for listening. Keep well and keep loving language.